Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are here at the NSCA National Conference here in Baltimore, and I'm extremely excited for the opportunity to talk to Paul Comfort. Paul is a professor of strength and conditioning at the University of Salford and is an adjunct professor at Edith Cowan University. He is also a founder and accredited member of the UK Strength and Conditioning Association. In addition to being an editor for the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, he has served as the editor for 4 books, including the second edition of Developing Power. Now, this book is so new that actually, as we record this now, it has not been released. But being that we are both here at the National Conference, I wanted to take the opportunity to actually talk to him and interview him about the book in person here. So, welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for your time. I know you have a busy schedule while you're here, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So first, I kind of want to set up the conversation here in explaining what exactly power is. I know we talk about it in sport and training. Everyone wants to be more powerful. I've never heard an athlete actually say, I don't want to be more powerful, or I want to be less powerful. So what does that actually mean to you?
So power, if you think about it from the biomechanical point of view, is force multiplied by velocity. That's the simple way that everyone refers to it. Mm-hmm. Technically, it's really work divided by time. So it's the highest volume of work you can perform over a given time. And within sports settings, that's a very limited period of time. So what we've got to be able to do is produce really high forces over a short duration to allow acceleration. And the higher that acceleration, generally the higher the amount of work we end up performing. And if we can do that in a shortened time frame, we've then enhanced our performance. And what we're really looking for is either producing more work in the same given time or the same amount of work in a shorter time. So it's really then about how we can achieve that through physiological and biomechanical adaptations to training.
So I guess when we talk about power and training for power for different sports, I usually think about, obviously creating force, and that's the way that we're generating power. Now, I think that can probably be different for different sports, I suppose. But how do you kind of look at that? Is power just the same across all sports? Is it just, I guess, the force application, the direction that we're pushing, or how would you assess that?
I think overall it is very similar across multiple different sports because we're still predominantly looking at rapid extension of the hips, knees and ankles, and we're looking at generating those forces, as I said, in very short periods of time. Now that varies depending on the activity. If you're looking at distance running, you still have to generate high power outputs to maintain your running velocity, but at high speed you've got a really short ground contact time, so you've got to be able to produce the force and the power very, very quickly. If we look at something then like sprinting, the initial few strides when you're accelerating, you might have between 400 and 500 milliseconds of ground contact time, so 5 times as long as when you're at top speed. So there are some nuances to it and there are some differences, but overall it's about being able to produce a really high force as quickly as you can, so that we can get that high level of acceleration. And if we increase that force, if you think about power being force times velocity, if we increase the force and we get a higher impulse, that will result in a higher velocity at the end. So just by increasing force over a given time frame, we increase power output because you've increased the force component, which then increases the velocity component. So for most people, we just need to get them stronger and improve their ability to express force very, very rapidly to make them more powerful.
What have been some of your experiences as far as training athletes or individuals in general? Maybe someone isn't naturally as powerful. Their fast twitch isn't as good as maybe some other athletes. What have been some of the challenges that you've seen in that respect?
One of the biggest things sometimes is actually getting buy-in to the type of training they need to do. Because you can see some athletes who are naturally very, very gifted. They can sprint really well, they can jump really high, but actually maybe they're not as strong as you need them to be and they haven't got a particularly good resistance training history. But because they can perform well on the field, they assume they don't necessarily need to do a huge amount of sort of resistance training, plyometric, ballistic training, or whatever that might be. So in some sports, it's really a case of trying to get the buy-in so that you can create those adaptations, because playing the sport will only get you so far. And we need to supplement that with the appropriate types of training to gain those adaptations. But that varies across sports.
Okay.
You know, it's dramatically different if you look at soccer in the UK or, you know, football in America. The cultural aspects of being in the gym and training are completely different. But that's also different between the different sporting organisations and the different sports clubs. So one of the biggest things is to get the buy-in, so we really get athletes training appropriately. That being said, you know, we might have an idea of what the ideal training methodologies are, and sometimes we can't use that. Sometimes the athletes, you know, don't think that's the appropriate way to train. We get it with soccer in the UK. You rarely get somebody with a heavy barbell on the shoulders.
Right.
But if you can hide that and use an iso inertial device, a flywheel device, there's a really, really high load. They just don't perceive that because all they see is the wheel spinning based on how much they accelerate it on the initial sort of propulsive phase. So sometimes you have to compromise and find alternative ways, but that still gives them some overload. And if we progressively overload them, then they're going to adapt and continue to improve.
Have you seen a lot of athletes probably have misconceptions about power? Like you said, maybe they're compensating in other areas, so they don't think that they need to train as much or in a way that's going to help them develop more power. How can you overcome that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's misconceptions about power, you know, across the board. You've only got to watch sport on TV and listen to commentators and the terms that they're using about strength and power, and they're generally, you know, the wrong way around, or completely wrong in some cases. But that's where a lot of people get their education from, is watching sport. So there's definitely some misconceptions about power. Sometimes people think it must be high velocity movements, but actually if you look back to the work that Prue Cormie did back in 2007 through to about 2011 or 12, she clearly demonstrated in her research that if you're not strong, the best way to enhance power output is to increase maximum force production capability. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you increase the amount of force you can produce in a given period of time, you get greater acceleration. And if you get greater acceleration, you've increased the force component, and greater acceleration increases the velocity component, so both force and velocity have increased. Or you've done more work in the same time or possibly less time. So part of the problem is that people don't necessarily know how to train for it. There was also a lot of research back around that same period where they were looking at the optimal load to achieve the highest power output. But you don't need to train at the load that elicits the highest power output in every given task. We need to train across a spectrum of loads, because athletes need to be powerful in terms of accelerating and moving their own body mass around, but also moving other masses around. So again, if you're in a collision sport, you've got to move somebody else. So you need to be powerful against additional resistance. And even if you're looking at, you know, throwing events, you're still accelerating your mass with something like shot put, discus, javelin, as well as the object that you're actually throwing. So you need to train it across that continuum, and that's sometimes where it's quite difficult, that a lot of people will think it just needs to be a very sport-specific task in terms of the movement needs to look like the sport. Well, you get that while you practice the sport. So we need to do something in a gym-based environment to actually increase your physical capability to allow you to accelerate appropriately and then generate those high forces or generate those power outputs across a spectrum of loads or a spectrum of time frames even.
So when you're talking about loads, something that just came to mind here, when we're talking about maybe a lift like a hang clean or a power snatch or something like that, which is actually more important, pulling heavier weight or simply just moving the bar faster? Like in something like that?
Yeah, they're both really important. So we need to make sure athletes can generate high power outputs across the whole sort of load velocity continuum. So we need to do some high load activities. And for people that are weak, that's definitely going to be probably give you the most bang for your buck and be the most effective. But then you also get examples where people are really, really strong. But you know, you can have an American football player or a rugby player who, you know, can squat 2.5 times body weight. So you know they're strong, but you look at their vertical jump and it's not great. Well, we don't need to chase after more strength at that point. We need to improve their ability to produce that force very rapidly rather than enhance maximum force production. If you flip that around and look at something like soccer, most of those cases, we tested about 1,000 athletes pre-season last year. If we ignore the goalkeepers, every single one of those athletes was weak. they all had a good vertical jump, or what you class as a good vertical jump for a soccer player. But for them to enhance their ability to jump, they probably just need to get stronger, because they were very efficient at producing force during jumping actions. They just didn't produce a lot of force. So it's a case of, how high does that force ceiling need to be? And if you're expressing 80% of your maximum isometric force during a ballistic task, we need to increase that ceiling. So we've got to take that as an individual approach for those athletes. And you can generalize to some extent in terms of looking at certain team sports. And yes, in most cases, soccer players need to get stronger. Most rugby, union league, and potentially football players probably need a bit more emphasis on more of that ballistic lower load training, because they generally do a huge amount of high load training because it's essential for the sport. Right.
So I guess in terms of that, where do you see the crossover? Or I guess the question should be, do you see people training too much for strength and not enough for power? In other words, like how strong is strong enough before you can really tap into that power component?
That's a great question, which no one has answered. And there certainly is in team sports. It seems to be around about that 2.5 times body weight back squat that people have sort of banded about as being the strength level you need to achieve, and then maybe you need greater emphasis on power development rather than strength development. But then if you look at data on weightlifters, you're getting them squatting 3.5 times body weight. And they've got to get to those strength levels when you consider the loads they're lifting and getting out of the hole when they've caught the bar in a clean or a snatch in that full depth position. So it does vary dramatically. Soccer players, I don't think you're going to find a single soccer player that can get anywhere near 2 times body weight as a back squat to a decent depth. So that doesn't mean you have to try and get them up there. But if they're squatting body mass only, if we get an increase and we get them up to 1.4 times body mass, that will enhance their performance. And then you might need greater emphasis then on the ballistic aspects rather than the strength aspects. And you're probably going to move them. And if you think of it as a set of scales, there's certain points where you're going to emphasize maximum strength and decrease the emphasis on the ballistic component. And other times those scales are going to move in the opposite direction. And that should almost be moving in a sequential approach. And we should be evaluating the athletes to say, did our training program enhance one component or the other, and then which do we need to emphasize now to take advantage of some of the adaptations that have taken place?
So you mentioned evaluating the athletes, and I know there is a portion of the book that talks about assessing and testing and kind of seeing exactly where those athletes are and what they need to do. What are some of those, testing components, or what are some of the most accurate ones that people might be able to do?
So probably the most accurate tests to really evaluate an athlete's overall performance would be to use a battery of tests, something like an isometric strength test, a multi-joint test, so the isometric mid-thigh pull or isometric squat. Then you can do more of a ballistic slow stretch shortening cycle task like a counter movement jump. And then you could do a reactive fast stretch shortening cycle task, some form of rebound jump. And that will give us a nice overview of how strong are they, how effectively can they express that force during a slow stretch shortening, more ballistic task, and how effectively can they do that during that more plyometric reactive task. And that gives us a nice profile for that athlete to say, which one of these do we need to emphasize? Sometimes you'll look and go, okay, we need to improve all of this. On the odd occasion, you will look and go, wow, the athlete's great at everything, but that's a very infrequent. And normally there's one where there's a clear deficit between them. That's not even necessarily assessing power output during those, but just looking at how those 3 different tasks compare, or their performances in the 3 tasks compare. If you've got somebody who's very strong, got a 50 centimeter vertical jump on a counter movement jump, but only a 20 centimeter reactive jump, it's pretty obvious that reactive component needs to improve. Again, you might find some people that have got the reactive and the ballistic part are fantastic. They're really good, They're doing that 50 centimeter counter movement jump. They've got a 50 centimeter rebound jump, but they're not very strong. It's pretty obvious that they need to increase that strength component. There are a range of other ways we can assess those things. Ideally, you use force plates because you can get so much extra data from that. But at the same time, if you've only got access to a jump mat or an iPhone or a smartphone app, you can use that quite reliably. And as long as you standardize your testing protocol and do it in the same way every time, if we're monitoring over time, then we get comparable results. So there's a whole range of different things you can look at, but it really depends what's at your disposal. But there are some pretty simple and cheap options that you can use for that.
Okay. Now this book does an excellent job of explaining power and going through, like we just talked about, assessments and I guess different ways to train power. But I know that there are also a number of case studies within the book that kind of help explain further. Now, what stands out to you most as far as the research and some of those case studies that I guess you've seen as significant?
Yeah. I think the really nice thing about this book is we've got a great combination of chapter authors who have both research experience, they've got applied backgrounds in sport, some that have got a combination of both. And we've got some really nice case studies in there looking at individual sports, looking at team sports, combat sports. So there's a real nice breadth of case studies within there. And I personally find editing it, I learned loads from going through that process because some of the chapter authors who have got, a decade and more of working in some of those sporting environments and some across a range of different sports gave a huge amount of insight into not just the ideal way of doing this, because the ideal textbook way is great, but also, well, can you do this in the real world? So having chapter authors who are really out there doing this for a living day to day, or who have done it in the past day to day, gives a great insight into, well, what are some of the different ways that we can do this, and how can we do it across a range of different individual or team sports. And they're the bits that are really, really interesting. They obviously come later in the book, once all the basic principles of how you develop, what is power, how you assess it, how you develop it in general, and then it gets more and more specific into those sports. And personally, they're the bits that I really enjoyed reading, because there's a lot of sports there that I haven't worked within, and it was just great to read some of those.
Do you think that's a challenge for a lot of people? Kind of getting that crossover between the science and the practical side. Really, I mean, like you just said, I mean, we can read a textbook, but how do you actually apply that? So I guess, what are some ways, like, do some of those case studies help with that, or what are some of those ways where coaches can, make sure that they transfer what they're reading to the field?
Yeah, the case studies definitely do that, because you've got some sort of real world case studies on this is how we would evaluate the athlete, this is how we would then put a training program in place. And they are examples. They're not meant to be prescriptive. It's not take this and go and do this with your athlete, because each athlete is individual and you need to do that needs analysis first. But it gives a nice insight into different ways to do it. And even when you see, an example which may say, as the example you gave earlier, a power clean or a hang power clean or a power snatch, you can substitute some of those different exercises. So is it hang power clean, or is it hang pull? Is it hang high pull? They're going to give you some similar adaptations in terms of power. So again, it's not to take it literally and say, this is the program, but it's, well, what can my athlete do? Is my athlete competent at performing some of those tasks? If they've never performed a power snatch, it's probably not going to be the best exercise to develop power. But if they're really good at hang power cleans, perfect, throw that in there. So it's really a case of looking at those and then amending that for your individual athlete, what they enjoy doing as well. Because if you give an athlete an exercise they don't like doing, they're not going to put in maximal intent, and the intent is really important. So it's really looking at these case studies and saying, well, there's a template, here's a blueprint, but how do I amend it? How do I adapt this? And how do I make it more appropriate for my athlete? You look at a general training program for a squad of athletes, and there'll be slight subtle variations in the sets or the repetitions or the variation of that exercise. Somebody might do a back squat, somebody might do a front squat, somebody could be doing a split squat because of limitations in their range of motion, the asymmetries, whatever it might be. So it's really to take this as a blueprint and say, here's a framework, this might work or this approach might work, but we can substitute a whole range of exercises to get a similar training stimulus.
That actually sounds like a great way to, approach it, because it's not telling you exactly what to do, but it's helping the coach actually learn in the process so they can find out exactly what's best for the athlete. Now, you have a very extensive background, but what is what is one thing that you kind of learned through this whole process or from the book?
I think one of the biggest things is to actually make sure you look at how other sports train. not just the sport you focus on. Because as you look at some of those different case studies, there are some similarities because you're training to develop power. So, the fundamental biomechanics and physiological principles in terms of how you stimulate an adaptation, what adaptation occurs, are very similar. But then how that's applied in those different sporting contexts, you can easily look and say, well, for certain individual sports, we could take this from one sport and move it to another. You can look at some of the work that somebody like Dr. Jeremy Shepherd did with surfing when he was working with Surf Australia, that he's now doing with snowboarding in Canada. And actually, they're very, very similar in terms of the types of exercise and the types of programming you might want to use as those examples. So one of the biggest things I think is to look at that range of different exercises, how you can program them, how you can sequence the exercises, look what people do in other sports, because there may be some really good exercises or combinations of exercises that would work equally as well in another sport. Because you're not looking at a movement that looks like your sport. We're looking at how do we create a specific adaptation to an imposed demand, how does that enhance power output, whether that's a set or a jump or whatever it might be. And it's very similar across those different sports. We just need to identify what are the key performance indicators for those sports, and that high load power or the low load, more higher velocity power output, what's going to be most beneficial.